Hello and welcome back to the safe combination tutorial for Ren'Py, part 4, and let's just jump straight back into it, shall we? So to those of you who are new to the channel but happen to like my content, I'd just like to say quickly that I have a Patreon page where you can support me, and this is actually very helpful to me, so thank you so much if you decide to join. And as usual, a big thank you to the patrons who are continuously supporting my channel. So we know that our dial is rotating by 3.6 increments every time we're turning it. And we also know that the dial contains values from 0 to 99 or 0 to 100 if you count 0 back to 0. So if we rotate the dial from 0 back to 0, so 360 degrees clockwise, then this dial text variable right here is going to contain the value 360. And that is because 3.6 times 100 is equal to 360. But since we don't want the dial text to contain the value 360, but rather 0, we're just going to make sure that we're resetting the dial's values back to 0 once we get to this point. And to do that, we are first of all going to create a new line just above here. And then we're going to say if int and then t rotate divided by 3.6 and then modulus 100 is equal to 0. So what are we actually doing here? Well, first of all, we are taking the rotate value of the transform and then we are dividing that by 3.6. And the resulting value from this calculation is going to give us the amount of steps that we have currently rotated the dial by. So if we have rotated the dial 100 steps clockwise, then this value is going to be 100. And then we're just making sure that this value is going to be a whole number, so an integer. So we are converting it to an integer right here. And then we're checking if that value can be cleanly divided by 100. And we're doing that by using the modulus operand and then saying 100 is equal to 0. So if this value divided by 100 is giving us 0 remainders, then we know that we must have rotated the dial all the way back to 0. But because when we are launching the game, the initial rotation of the dial is going to be 0, then this if statement is also going to be true because 0 divided by 100 is going to give us 0 in remainders. So to make sure that this if statement is only going to run whenever the value is in the hundreds, we're going to add another condition. And this condition is going to look like this. And int t rotate divided by 3.6 is not equal to 0, like so. So we're doing the same thing as we did here. We're simply checking if the rotate value of the transform divided by 3.6 is not equal to 0. So now if this entire if statement is true, then we know that we must have a value in the hundreds. And then instead of this if statement, we're going to do two things. The first one is to set the dial number variable to 0. So we're going to say dial number is equal to 0. And because we're changing this value inside of this function, we're going to go ahead and make it into a global. So we're going to go up here and say global dial number. And then we'll go back down. And then the next thing we're going to do is to set the rotate amount attribute of the dial sprite to 0 as well. So we're going to say dial sprite dot rotate amount is equal to 0.0. So now that we have fixed that, we're going to make sure that if we have not rotated the dial 360 degrees, but instead have chosen some other value, such as 10 or 33 or any other value, then we're just going to make sure that the dial number variable contains the correct value on the dial that we have selected. So for that, we're going to create an else statement. So we're going to create a new line and then go inwards once in the indentations and then say else, and then we're going to say dial number is equal to int t rotate divided by 3.6. So now let's say that we have rotated the dial 2 steps clockwise so that this rotate value of the transform contains the value 7.2. If we then divide this value by 3.6, we're going to get 2, which is the correct value according to what we have selected on the dial. So now to test if this is working correctly, we're going to make sure that we're swapping the t rotate value for the dial text variable to instead be the dial number variable. So we're going to say dial number, like so. So now we can go ahead and save our changes and then launch the game to see how this looks like. So now let's go ahead and rotate the dial clockwise and counterclockwise to see what the value up here is going to show us. So one step clockwise is giving us the value 1, and then 2, and then 3, and 4, and so on. And then counterclockwise from the value 0 is giving us -1, -2, -3, and so on. So we know that that is working correctly. Now the only problem is of course that we're getting negative values when we're rotating counterclockwise. So instead of getting 8, we're getting -8. And if we go to the left of the 0, instead of getting 99 and 98, for example, we're getting 1 and 2. So we're going to go back into the code and fix that now. So a simple way of fixing that issue is to first of all check if the dial number variable happens to have a value that is more than 0, or if it happens to have a value that is less than 0. Because if it's more than 0, if we have, for example, rotated the dial one step clockwise, then we're going to get the value 1. And because we want the value to say 99 instead of 1, we can simply subtract that value from 100, which is going to give us 99. So let's go ahead and do that first. So we're going to create a new line just underneath this else statement right here. And then we're going to say if dial number is more than 0. And then we can go ahead and move this line right underneath here, where we are setting the dial text variable to have the value of the dial number, to here instead, like so. And then we're going to say 100 minus dial number, like so. So this is going to give us the correct value when we are rotating the dial clockwise from 0. And to make this code a little bit more readable, I'm just going to add an empty line just underneath this else statement, like so. So now we're going to check if the dial number variable happens to have a value that is less than 0 instead. So we're going to create a new line and then say elif dial number is less than 0. And in such a case, we want to set the dial text to the dial number variable, but we don't want it to be set to a negative value, but rather a positive one. So we're going to use the abs function on the dial number variable to turn it into a positive value. So for that, we're going to say dial text is equal to abs and then dial number, like so. But now if the dial number variable instead happens to have the value 0, so it's not more than 0 and it's not less than 0, then we're going to have to create another else statement that is going to take that into account as well. Because in such a case, we just want the dial text to show 0. So let's go ahead and create a new line. And then we're going to say else, and then dial text is equal to, and here we can either say 0 or dial number. Because if the dial number is not more than 0 and it's not less than 0, then it has to be 0, and so therefore we can just say dial text is equal to dial number. So now let's go ahead and save our changes and then launch the game to see what this looks like. So now let's go ahead and rotate the dial and see what happens. So now we can see that if we rotate one step clockwise, we get the value 99 instead of 1, which is exactly what we want. And then if we continue, we can see that we get all the correct values. So we know that that is working. And then let's go back to 0. And we get 0 instead of 100. And then this way, we can see that we now get all positive values instead of negative ones. So that is also correct. And now let's try and see what happens if we rotate all the way back to 0 clockwise. We get 0 as well here. So now that we know that that is working, let's go back into the code and see what else we can do. So now that our dial is working correctly and we're getting the correct value to display just above it when we have selected a value, we can go ahead and add some sound effect to play as we are rotating the dial. And for that, we could just go ahead and add a new line underneath this else statement right here and tell Ren'Py to play this sound effect. But that is going to cause the sound effect to play every time we are moving the mouse while holding the mouse button down on the dial. But that is not exactly what we want, but we rather want it to only play the sound effect when the dial has snapped to a new value. So to make that work, we're going to check if the dial text variable has a different value since the last time we rotated the dial. So only if we have rotated the dial to a new value are we going to have the dial play this sound effect. So for that, we're going to need a new variable. So we're going to scroll back down to the start label. And then here in the dial variables section, we're going to say previous dial text is equal to, and the initial value is going to be 0. And then we go back up to our function right here. And we're going to make this new variable into a global straight away. So we're going to say global previous dial text. And then we'll scroll back down to here. And then after this else statement right here, we're going to create a few lines. And then we're going to create a new if statement. So we're going to say if dial text is not equal to previous dial text, like so. So as long as the new dial text is not equal to the old dial text, then we're going to play this sound effect. So for that, we're going to say renpy dot music dot play, and then we're going to pass in a few parameters to this function. And the first one is the file path to the audio that we want to play. So for that, we're going to say audio dial.og, and then we're going to pass in the channel where this audio file is going to play, and that is going to be sound. And then we're just going to lower the volume on this sound just a little bit. So for that, we're going to say relative volume is equal to 0.3, and that is going to give us a 30% volume. And then underneath this if statement, we're going to say previous dial text is equal to dial text, like so. So here we're making sure that at the very end of this else if statement, we are setting the previous dial text variable to the dial text variable's value, so that the next time we run this function in this else if statement, we can check if the dial text has changed to a new value by comparing it to the old value that we're setting here. So with that done, let's go ahead and save our changes and then launch the game to see what this looks like. So now let's go ahead and rotate the dial and see if we can hear any sound. And as we can hear, that does seem to work indeed, as we hear a little click every time we rotate the dial. So that is going to be it for this video, and in the next part we're going to make sure that we can open up the safe by entering in a combination of numbers. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.